Most people saw the headline about Iran and kept scrolling, but the phrase Trump used to describe those strikes, the way he framed it, that's not standard military language. And I think he chose those words very, very deliberately. Before I explain why, drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this is reaching. Genuinely curious. So let's start with what actually came out of the president's mouth yesterday. He's coming back from the World Cup final. Big event. Cameras are rolling. Reporters are shouting questions. And instead of giving some generic line about national security, he says the U.S. is striking Iran very hard to honor dead American service members. Now, pause on that, because that is a specific kind of framing. That's not a strategic military briefing. That's not a diplomatic statement. That's something else. And I want to walk you through what I think is actually going on here, because the difference between what he said and what he didn't say is the whole reason this matters. Here's the situation. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump told reporters that the U.S. military had just completed its 9th consecutive night of strikes against Iranian military targets. 9 nights. That's not a one-off retaliation. That's a sustained campaign. And he tied it directly to American troops who were killed recently in the region. He said, quote, "We feel very badly about those fatalities." Then he said those troops were fighting to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And then he said the strikes are hitting Iran very hard. Now look, if you've been paying attention to how this administration talks about military action, you know that phrasing matters. Every single word is tested. Every single angle is polled. And the way he framed this, it's not accidental. Because here's what he didn't say. He didn't say we're striking Iran to degrade their military capacity. He didn't say we're doing this to protect our allies in the region. He didn't even say we're doing it to stop an imminent attack. He said we're doing it to honor the dead. And that's a shift. That's a shift from deterrent to retribution, from strategy to vengeance, from cold military calculus to something a lot more personal. And when a president frames military action that way, the rules of engagement change. The public's tolerance for casualties changes. The diplomatic calculus changes. Everything changes. So let me back up for a second, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. The lead up to this moment goes back months, years, honestly. The tension between the U.S. and Iran has been building since the early days of the Trump administration. Maximum pressure campaign, sanctions, the killing of Soleimani back in 2020. Then Iran's uranium enrichment creeping closer and closer to weapons grade. Everybody in the national security world has been watching this thing slowly escalate. But what's different now, and this is the part that isn't getting enough attention, is the psychological shift inside the administration. Because you don't get to 9 consecutive nights of strikes without a fundamental decision being made at the highest levels. That's not a series of isolated incidents. That's a deliberate escalation strategy. And Trump just gave us the emotional justification for it. He said the troops who died were fighting to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. That's important. That's the stated mission. But then he linked their deaths directly to the intensity of the strikes. We're hitting them very hard. Think about what that means in practice. That means the U.S. military is not just targeting nuclear facilities. They're not just hitting missile sites. The phrase very hard implies a broader campaign. Infrastructure, supply lines, maybe even leadership. And if it's tied to avenging dead troops, the targeting decisions change. You start hitting things that hurt, not just things that disable. And that's where this gets dangerous. Because Iran has options here. They have proxies all over the region. Hezbollah, the Houthis, militias in Iraq and Syria. They have asymmetric capabilities that can reach U.S. forces and U.S. allies in ways that conventional military power can't fully defend against. So the question becomes, what happens when Iran responds? Because they will respond. They have to respond. Their entire regional posture depends on being seen as a credible threat. If they take 9 consecutive nights of strikes and do nothing, their deterrence evaporates. Their allies lose confidence. Their enemies get bolder. So Iran is going to hit back. The only real question is how hard and against whom. Let me tell you something that's been bothering me about this whole thing. I've been covering U.S. foreign policy for, well, long enough to know the patterns. And the pattern here is a little too clean, a little too convenient. Because here's what I mean by that. The president makes this statement right after the World Cup final. Why? Why that moment? Why not a formal address from the Oval Office? Why not a Pentagon briefing? Because he wanted the contrast. He wanted the image of celebration, the global unity of sports. And then he wanted to remind everyone that America is at war. He wanted the whiplash. He wanted the emotional jarring. That was a choice. And it was a choice designed to do something very specific. It was designed to reframe the conflict in moral terms, not strategic terms. Moral terms. This isn't about oil. This isn't about regional hegemony. This isn't about Israel's security, even though that's part of it. According to the president, this is about honoring the fallen. And once you accept that framing, what follows becomes much harder to oppose, because who's going to argue against honoring dead soldiers? Who's going to say we shouldn't hit Iran hard if it means avenging American lives? Nobody. That's who. So now the administration has a rhetorical shield. They can escalate as much as they want, and any criticism can be deflected as disrespect to the troops. It's a classic move. It's been used before. But that doesn't make it less effective. And it doesn't make it less dangerous. Let's talk about what 9 consecutive nights of strikes actually looks like. Because it's easy to hear a number like that and not really feel it. 9 nights. That's over a week of sustained bombardment. Every single night, U.S. aircraft and missiles are hitting targets inside Iran, inside a sovereign nation. 9 nights in a row. That's not a signal. That's a campaign. And campaigns have objectives. They have end states. They have criteria for success and failure. So what's the objective here? Is it to destroy Iran's nuclear program entirely? Because that would require ground troops. That would require a full-scale invasion. Is the U.S. prepared for that? Does the American public have the stomach for that? Probably not. Is it to cripple Iran's military capability to the point where they can't respond? Because that's a moving target. Iran has invested decades in decentralized systems. They built redundancies. They've spread their assets across the country. You can't just bomb that into submission. Is it to force regime change? If that's the goal, then we're talking about a long-term commitment. Occupation, counterinsurgency, nation building. All the things this administration has explicitly said they don't want to do. So what's the actual plan here? Because I've been reading the statements, I've been watching the press conferences, and I can't find an answer. Nobody can. And that's the part that scares me. Because when you start a military campaign without a clear, achievable end state, you don't get to decide when it ends. The enemy does. The situation on the ground does. You just keep escalating until somebody blinks or until it's too late to stop. And the president's comments yesterday suggest we are a long way from blinking. So let's go back to the fallen troops for a second, because I don't want to lose sight of the human cost here. These are real people, real families, real Americans who put on the uniform and went to a dangerous place and didn't come home. That deserves to be honored. That deserves to be acknowledged. But the question I keep coming back to is, did this administration honor them, or did they use them? Because there's a difference between remembering the fallen and using their sacrifice as a justification for an escalation that was already planned. And I'm not sure which one we just saw. Here's the thing about the military. They're professionals. They follow orders. If the commander-in-chief says we're striking Iran to honor our dead, they're going to strike Iran. But that doesn't mean the strikes were actually about honor. That just means that's the narrative being attached to them. And I think the troops themselves would have wanted a different answer. I think they would have wanted to know, is this strike actually making us safer? Is it actually preventing the next attack? Or is it just making the people who died feel like symbols in a larger political game? Because they didn't die to be symbols. They died because they were sent somewhere dangerous. And they were sent there because somebody in Washington made a decision that they should be there. That's the uncomfortable part that nobody wants to talk about. We don't have troops in the region by accident. We have them there by policy. And if that policy puts them in harm's way and they die, and then we use their deaths to justify an even more aggressive policy, That's not honor. That's a cycle that keeps generating more deaths. So let me ask you something directly. Do you believe the president when he says these strikes are about honoring the fallen? Or do you think there's something else going on? Because I've been going back through the timeline, and here's what I've noticed. In the weeks leading up to these strikes, the administration had been signaling a harder line on Iran. The rhetoric was escalating. The sanctions were getting tighter. The naval deployments were increasing. This wasn't a response to a specific event. This was a posture that had been building for months. The deaths of those service members, they were a catalyst. They provided the emotional cover for what was already in motion. And I'm not saying that to be cynical. I'm saying that because if we don't understand how these things actually work, we can't hold anyone accountable. We just react. We just feel. We just stay angry and scared and confused. And that's exactly the state they want us in. Let me take you inside the room where this decision was made. Because I've been talking to people who know people who work in the national security apparatus, people who have been in those situation room meetings. And what they're telling me is the debate was actually much more heated than the public knows. There were voices inside the administration who argued for a more restrained response, for targeted strikes against specific nuclear sites, for keeping the escalation contained. And there were other voices who argued for something much bigger. Voices that said the U.S. has been too passive with Iran for too long. Voices that said the only way to stop their nuclear program is to make them pay a price so steep they'll never try again. Voices that said this is the moment, right now, to break their will. And Trump came down on the side of the hawks. He came down on the side of hitting them very hard. And he did it publicly, with cameras rolling, framing it as a tribute to the dead. That was a political choice, a strategic choice, a choice with consequences that are still unfolding as we speak. And here's the part that I don't think enough people are talking about. The military didn't ask for this. Let me say that again. The Pentagon was not pushing for a massive escalation. The commanders on the ground were not saying, please send more strikes. We need to hit them harder. Military professionals understand that escalation is a two-way street. They understand that every action creates a reaction. But the civilian leadership, the political appointees, they were pushing for this. They wanted to send a message. They wanted to demonstrate resolve. They wanted to show Iran that the U.S. has teeth. And the president agreed. So now we have 9 nights of strikes. Counting last night, that's 9. And we have the president telling the world that the reason for all this intensity is honor. Honor for the dead. But what about the living? What about the troops who are still in the region, who are now facing an even more dangerous situation because Iran is going to retaliate? What about the sailors on the ships in the Gulf who are going to be on higher alert? What about the diplomats who are going to have to manage the fallout? They're the ones who have to live with the consequences, and so do we. Let me tell you a story. Actually, let me tell you about a report I read. It was from the intelligence community, unclassified, but not widely circulated. It analyzed Iran's response patterns to past U.S. strikes. And the conclusion was basically this: when Iran feels like their survival is threatened, they don't retaliate in a measured way. They don't match the scale. They escalate. They find a vulnerability and they hit it hard. And one of their favorite vulnerabilities is our troops. So the president just escalated a conflict, framed it as honoring troops, and in doing so may have made those troops less safe. That's the paradox. That's the part that doesn't sit right with me. Because if you actually want to honor the fallen, you don't put more lives at risk. You don't increase the danger. You figure out how to de-escalate. You figure out how to bring people home. That's what honor looks like. Not this. Not a campaign of 9 nights of strikes and counting. So here's where we are right now. The U.S. is in an escalating military confrontation with Iran. The president has framed it as a moral obligation to the dead. The military is carrying out orders. Iran is preparing to respond. The region is bracing. And nobody seems to have a clear answer for how this ends. That's the part that should scare you. Because when you start a conflict without an exit strategy, the exit strategy becomes winning. And winning in a military confrontation with a country like Iran, that's not a realistic concept. There is no decisive military victory. There's just a grinding escalation that consumes lives and treasure and political capital until someone finally decides they've had enough. And I don't see anyone in this administration signaling that they've had enough. I see the opposite. I see a president who just used the World Cup final to talk about bombing Iran. I see him choosing his words carefully, hitting them very hard to honor the dead. I see him building a case for more, not less. So let me ask you again. Do you think this is about honor, or do you think this is about something else? Because I've been watching this whole thing unfold. And the more I watch, the more I think the honor is just the packaging. The real content is something much older, much more dangerous. It's the illusion of control. The belief that you can shape events through force. The conviction that strength always wins. And I'm not sure any of that is true. I think we're in for a long, dangerous ride. And I think the president's comments yesterday, as simple as they seemed, were a signal that the restraint is gone, that the gloves are off, that the U.S. is committed to this path, come what may. and the world is going to have to live with the consequences. So let me leave you with this. Over the next few days, watch what Iran does. Watch what the U.S. does in response. Watch the language from both sides. Watch for the small moves that indicate whether this is going to escalate or plateau. And remember that the dead we're honoring, the ones the president talked about, they didn't get a choice in any of this. They served. They followed orders. They died. And now their names are being used. Use them to justify a war. That's not honor. That's something else. And I think in our hearts, we all know the difference. We just have to be willing to say it out loud, because the silence is what lets this keep happening. All right. I've said my piece. This isn't over. Not even close. The next few weeks are going to tell us a lot about where this is headed. And I'll be right here walking through it with you, piece by piece. So stay with me. We're going to need to keep talking about this.